Britain's energy empire is collapsing right now. 85 right now. At dawn this morning, major power companies pulled the plug on the United Kingdom, walking away from billion-pound contracts as the government's radical net zero plan backfires in spectacular fashion. The result, a crisis so massive that insiders are already calling it the blackout of the century. It started quietly, almost too quietly. Just after 6 a.m, EDF Energy's headquarters in London sent out a single statement that sent shockwaves through global markets. Effective immediately, all UK operations are suspended. Within minutes, Centrica, E.ON, RWE and Scottish Power followed suit. One by one, the pillars of Britain's power sector began to crumble. An exodus so sudden, it made financial analysts question whether the government had lost control entirely. What could possibly drive these corporate giants who have profited for decades from British households to abandon ship overnight? The answer, it seems, lies in one word: ideology. Last Thursday, in what the media called a bold climate move and what industry leaders now describe as economic suicide, Climate Minister Ed Miliband announced that all gas-fired power stations must shut down by 2026, not 2035 as originally planned. 2026. That's just over a year from now. The decision, made under pressure to prove Labour's global green credentials, stunned experts who warned that 42% of the nation's electricity still depends on gas. But apparently, political ambition now outranks basic arithmetic. And as the government doubled down on its new deadline, energy executives decided to do something Britain hasn't seen since the 1970s: fight back. By early morning, National Grid executives were in crisis mode. Emergency meetings, internal warnings, late-night calls to Downing Street. The system was spiralling. Britain faces a 30% power deficit this winter, leaked notes from the meeting revealed. 30%, that's not a number, it's a national emergency. Imagine 17 million homes without power for 8 hours a day. Factories silent. Hospitals relying on backup generators. Ordinary families huddled around battery lamps while politicians lecture them about climate progress. The government insists this is a temporary adjustment. But how temporary can it be when half your grid providers have packed their bags and left? Energy analysts call it corporate defiance, the moment the private sector told the government enough is enough. EDF's CEO described the new net zero mandate as operationally impossible and economically suicidal. Others were blunter. A leaked email from a senior RWE executive reportedly stated, "The laws of physics don't change just because Parliament wants headlines." Harsh words, but brutally accurate. You can pass all the bills you want, but you can't power a country on political slogans. The chaos didn't stop there. Within hours of the mass withdrawal, the pound fell to its lowest value in 6 months. Stock markets froze energy trading. Hardware stores across Britain saw a sudden surge in sales of generators, candles and camping stoves. Social media exploded with hashtags like #BlackoutBritain and #PowerCrash2025. People began sharing tips on how to keep insulin cool without electricity and how to cook without gas. Britain, a G7 nation, was suddenly behaving like a country preparing for war, but the enemy this time isn't another nation, it's policy. Behind the polished smiles of government press briefings, panic is brewing. Treasury officials are scrambling to find billions in emergency funding to keep the lights on. The Department for Energy Security is reportedly considering partial nationalisation of remaining power assets, though one insider called it financially impossible. You can't buy back what's already collapsing. But here's the real scandal. Multiple sources now confirm that ministers were warned weeks ago that the accelerated timeline would trigger this exact meltdown. So the question becomes, if they knew, why did they go ahead anyway? Insiders whisper that the Prime Minister himself overruled expert advice, allegedly saying, "Short-term instability is worth it for long-term credibility." Credibility. Tell that to the pensioners who can't afford heating or the hospitals about to ration electricity. Meanwhile, Downing Street insists Britain will lead the world into carbonisation. But lead to where? Into darkness, into economic collapse, into the cold reality of ideology over survival. And while ordinary citizens brace for rolling blackouts, government offices and ministerial homes won't feel a flicker. Why? Because Whitehall is reportedly equipped with high-capacity military-grade generators, guaranteed power, while millions may shiver in unheated homes. The same ministers urging everyone to do their part will enjoy uninterrupted heating, lighting and gourmet dinners. How's that for equality? The hypocrisy is staggering. Politicians talk about sacrifice, but the sacrifice always seems to belong to someone else. The working class, the elderly, the powerless in every sense. As the nation edges toward an unprecedented energy emergency, trust in leadership is evaporating faster than the lights are dimming. But what if this crisis isn't just incompetence? What if it's something bigger, something deliberate? Because here's the real question, haunting every corridor of power tonight. Did the government just gamble Britain's entire energy future for the sake of political theatre? As the morning chaos turned into a national emergency, the government scrambled to project control. But behind closed doors, even senior ministers privately admitted that Britain had entered uncharted territory. Emergency meetings inside Downing Street stretched through the night. Treasury officials demanded immediate impact assessments, and the national grid warned of catastrophic instability if power generation capacity continued to collapse. But despite the desperate tone, the political message remained unchanged. Stay the course, stay green. It was as if ideology had taken command while reality was locked outside in the dark. Reporters swarmed Westminster as rumours of ministerial resignations began to circulate. 2 junior energy ministers were said to have walked out in protest, calling the policy reckless and detached from physics. Their departures sent another shockwave through an already panicked government, trying to convince the public everything was fine. By midday, the streets told a different story. Across London, Manchester and Birmingham, queues formed outside hardware stores as citizens rushed to buy torches, gas heaters and portable stoves. Some supermarket shelves were already empty of candles and batteries. Families began filling buckets with water and stocking up on tinned food. For many, this wasn't a theoretical crisis anymore, it was survival planning. News channels replayed interviews with pensioners who said they would rather skip meals than face another freezing night without power. The contrast between official optimism and public fear was striking. Government spokespeople promised temporary disruptions, but no one could explain how Britain would replace 42% of its power supply in 18 months. Social media turned brutal, mocking ministers with memes showing light switches labelled net zero mode off. Yet behind the humour was genuine anxiety. Inside the Department for Energy Security, civil servants worked frantically to draft emergency plans, including rotating power cuts and nationalisation options. An internal memo leaked that afternoon revealed a grim reality. Even if Britain tried to buy emergency electricity from Europe, interconnector systems could not handle the required capacity. The grid, once seen as one of the most advanced in the world, was now on the verge of failure. Engineers described the situation as a slow-motion collapse that no political spin can reverse. One veteran official summed it up: "You can't legislate Watts into existence." At the same time, the financial impact was beginning to unfold. The pound dropped further and investors began pulling billions from UK energy infrastructure funds. International markets saw Britain not as a climate leader, but as a cautionary tale of political overreach. As panic grew, another figure stepped unexpectedly into the spotlight: King Charles. Palace officials confirmed he had requested an urgent briefing from the Prime Minister, breaking royal protocol to discuss the humanitarian implications of the crisis. His intervention was polite but pointed: the welfare of vulnerable citizens must come before political ambition. For a monarch known for his environmental advocacy, the statement carried immense weight and devastating symbolism. When even the king starts questioning a government's energy policy, it signals more than public concern. It signals national doubt. Newspapers across the country ran headlines like "The King Intervenes" and "Crown Concern Over Climate Chaos." Political analysts described it as the most significant royal involvement in domestic policy since World War II. Meanwhile, in the industrial north, anger was reaching boiling point. Workers at soon-to-close power plants and factories held impromptu protests, chanting, "We keep the lights on until they turn us off." Local councillors from traditional Labour strongholds condemned the policy, saying it betrayed the working class for green showmanship. Many reminded the government that Britain's energy sector wasn't just about electricity, it was about livelihoods, pride, and national security. Businesses began announcing production cuts, hospitals prepared emergency energy protocols, and transport networks braced for possible shutdowns. The crisis was no longer theoretical, it was operational, economic, and deeply human. Even environmental groups started to fracture. Prominent activists warned that rushing the transition without reliable alternatives would damage public support for green policies for decades. People won't back the environment if it means they can't heat their homes, one campaigner admitted in a viral interview. But the government's tone hardened. Ministers repeated the same phrase in every press conference: "We must act boldly for the planet." To critics, it sounded less like conviction and more like denial as Britain's lights began to flicker, literally and politically. The gap between the government's promises and the country's reality grew into a chasm. The question, spreading across social media now, wasn't whether Britain could achieve net zero, but whether it could survive it. And as the clock ticked toward another cold night, one haunting question echoed through the nation. What happens when the lights finally go out and the government still insists everything is under control? By the following morning, Britain was no longer just anxious, it was unravelling. The energy crisis had exploded into full-blown political chaos. Newspapers carried front-page photos of darkened city skylines, hospitals running on generators, and pensioners queuing outside community centres for hot meals. The sense of national humiliation was palpable. A country that once powered empires now struggled to keep the lights on in its own capital. Inside Whitehall, ministers argued over who was to blame. Treasury officials accused the Department for Energy Security of gross mismanagement, while Ed Miliband's office claimed the crisis was a deliberate act of corporate blackmail. Yet behind the shouting, one truth emerged that no one could spin away. The warnings had been clear, written and ignored. Leaked cabinet documents began circulating among journalists, confirming that senior ministers had been explicitly warned that forcing the 2026 deadline would trigger provider withdrawal and grid failure. One confidential assessment stated bluntly the critical risk of supply deficit exceeding 60% during peak demand. The report had even been signed off by the Prime Minister's office. The leak detonated like a political bomb. Opposition leaders called it premeditated negligence. Commentators compared it to the Iraq dossier scandal, a government overriding expert warnings for political optics. Public outrage surged. Thousands flooded social media demanding resignations. The hashtags Who Knew and Lights Out Starmer dominated the digital landscape, while protesters gathered outside Parliament holding candles and placards reading, "We warned you." Inside the chaos, whispers grew louder that the government might fall. At least 5 cabinet ministers were rumoured to be drafting letters of resignation. Energy Minister Sarah Jones broke ranks first, releasing a statement that stunned Westminster. Decarbonisation cannot come at the cost of human survival. We have made an unforgivable mistake. Her words instantly went viral, and by sunset, she was trending across every major platform. Labour MPs from industrial and northern constituencies began publicly distancing themselves from party leadership. One backbencher called the crisis a self-inflicted national wound. The opposition seized the moment, presenting a united front for energy realism and hinting at a no-confidence motion. For the first time in decades, Parliament looked genuinely unstable, not because of scandal, but because of electricity. As Britain's political system strained under the weight of its own ambition, the economic aftershocks rippled outward. Manufacturing hubs in the Midlands and Yorkshire began shutting down production lines. Supermarkets reported spoilage of perishable goods due to power cuts. The financial sector was jittery. Banks quietly activated emergency protocols to ensure data centers remained operational. Every hour of blackout meant billions lost. Economists warned that a recession, deeper than the pandemic, was inevitable if stability wasn't restored within weeks. Meanwhile, global markets watched in disbelief. European partners began restricting electricity exports to the UK to protect their own supplies, effectively isolating Britain from continental support. Canada, Germany, and even France issued statements emphasising the importance of balanced transition, a diplomatic way of saying Britain had gone too far, too fast. And amid all this turmoil, ordinary citizens bore the brunt. In the town of Leeds, small business owners stood outside shuttered shops, unable to operate without power. In Newcastle, an elderly couple interviewed by local media said they spent the night wrapped in blankets, eating cold soup by candlelight. Charities set up warm banks, emergency shelters powered by generators as temperatures began to fall. The government promised compensation schemes and emergency aid, but no amount of money could generate electricity that didn't exist. What was once an ideological debate had become a humanitarian disaster. Then came the most shocking development yet. Late that evening, multiple security sources confirmed that MI5 had issued a confidential briefing warning of heightened national vulnerability. Power outages, they said, were being monitored by foreign intelligence agencies, and cyber units were already attempting to exploit gaps in the grid's weakened defences. Britain's energy instability had turned into a security risk. GCHQ analysts were deployed to protect infrastructure, but even they admitted privately that resilience was below safe thresholds. The fear was no longer just about lights going out, it was about who might take advantage when they did. Inside number 10, the mood was described as apocalyptic. Advisors whispered of a government on life support, clinging to the illusion of control as its credibility disintegrated. Journalists camped outside Downing Street, waiting for a resignation that hadn't yet come. Opposition leaders demanded immediate reversal of the 2026 timeline and emergency negotiations with remaining power companies. But with most providers already gone, there was little left to negotiate. Britain was facing the coldest winter in decades, with half its energy system dismantled and its leadership divided. And as midnight approached, the unthinkable question echoed across newsrooms and households alike. Was this just an energy crisis or the beginning of Britain's political collapse? By the next dawn, Britain had entered a new phase of crisis, not just political or economic, but existential. The morning news didn't speak of power shortages anymore. It spoke of survival. Emergency broadcasts urged citizens to conserve energy, while grid operators admitted they could no longer guarantee continuous power in several regions. Cities were running on rotating blackouts. London, the financial heart of the nation, looked like a ghost metropolis. Office towers dim, underground stations eerily silent, traffic lights dead. The hum of modern life had vanished, replaced by the sound of generators and panic. And as the public demanded accountability, the government's silence grew heavier. The Prime Minister hadn't been seen in 48 hours. Rumours swirled that he was holed up with advisors drafting a resignation speech, while others whispered that he was negotiating with international energy firms to salvage what little trust remained. Meanwhile, the energy exodus had gone global. Former UK suppliers, now relocating to the EU, began issuing public statements that painted a damning picture of the British administration. One CEO bluntly declared, "We warned them." They didn't listen. This was political theatre turned policy disaster. The statement reverberated across world media, drawing parallels to the financial collapse of 2008. But this time, it wasn't money that vanished. It was power itself. Economists compared Britain's situation to a modern blackout depression, predicting months of production losses and soaring unemployment. The once proud promise of green leadership now read like an obituary for common sense. Other nations quietly slowed their own net zero commitments, fearing the same fate. Britain, once hailed as a climate pioneer, had become the cautionary tale no one wanted to repeat. The cracks within the government widened beyond repair. Secret recordings leaked from a high-level meeting revealed senior officials accusing each other of sabotage and cover-ups. One furious voice shouted, "You buried the risk reports!" Another snapped back, "You told us to!" The recordings spread like wildfire online, fueling conspiracy theories that the entire policy had been a staged economic reset. A deliberate push to break the fossil fuel giants and centralise control of Britain's energy under state authority. Whether true or not, the public didn't care. Trust had collapsed entirely. Opinion polls showed the government's approval rating at a historic low. Single digits. Civil servants began quietly resigning. Parliament sessions turned into shouting matches. The opposition demanded an immediate election, while protesters gathered by the thousands outside Downing Street chanting for justice, light and truth. In the chaos, unexpected alliances began forming. Small business coalitions, labour unions and even climate activists, groups usually divided, united under a single banner: fix the power, save the people. They accused the government of weaponising the climate agenda to score international credibility while ignoring domestic consequences. Their demand was simple: suspend the 2026 deadline and restore energy independence, whatever the environmental cost. The irony was bitter. A movement born to protect the planet was now pleading for the revival of coal plants just to keep hospitals running. The moral debate that once seemed noble had become painfully human. Warmth over ideology, survival over symbolism. As tensions peaked, foreign aid offers began to trickle in. France offered limited electricity transfers on humanitarian grounds. The US promised to send emergency fuel shipments. Even Norway, once Britain's closest energy ally, warned that their supplies were stretched thin. It was a grim image. The UK, once a beacon of industrial strength, now dependent on neighbours to keep its hospitals lit. In a moment of rare honesty, a BBC anchor said, during a live broadcast, "This isn't a green revolution anymore, it's a national reckoning." The words struck deep. Then, without warning, a chilling revelation surfaced. An investigative journalist released documents suggesting that a handful of high-ranking officials had quietly invested in renewable energy corporations based abroad. The very companies now profiting from Britain's downfall. The implication was devastating. While citizens froze, policymakers might have been playing a global financial game. The story broke across every screen, sparking outrage and disbelief. Protesters flooded the streets again, their chants louder, angrier, more desperate than ever. For the first time, police struggled to contain the crowds. London's iconic skyline glowed not with light, but with the flicker of torches and phone flashlights, a symbolic rebellion against a government that had literally and figuratively left them in the dark. And as the night deepened, a grim realisation settled over the nation. This was no longer just about energy policy. It was about power in every sense of the word, political, moral and literal. The collapse had revealed something far greater, a government blinded by its own ambition and a nation forced to pay the price. The question on every trembling lip was the same, echoing through darkened streets and cold living rooms across Britain. If this is the cost of saving the planet, who will save Britain?